You ever smell a lie before you see it? The scent hit me first, sweet, crushed blueberries mixed with hot diesel and fresh dirt, a smell that didn't belong together, a smell that meant something was very wrong. I hadn't even stepped out of my truck yet, just sitting there at the edge of my own property, watching a yellow bulldozer roll straight through rows my mother planted 25 years ago, its steel tracks flattening bushes that were just starting to fruit for the season. The low hum of the engine vibrated through the ground, through the steering wheel, through my chest like a warning I was already too late to stop. My name is Daniel Harper, and that field, those 10 acres of blueberry rows stretching out under the Texas sun, wasn't just land, it was the last thing my family ever built together. I pushed the door open, boots crunching against gravel as I stepped out, the heat already rising off the soil in waves, carrying that sharp, metallic tang of machinery where there should have been nothing but clean air and ripe fruit. A man in a neon vest waved lazily at me like I was the one trespassing, like I didn't belong there, like those wooden stakes hammered into the ground with bright orange flags weren't cutting through something that had my name on it. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked forward, slow, steady, each step sinking slightly into dirt that had been turned over by equipment that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Then I saw the sign. White board, black letters, planted right in the center of my field like a flag on conquered land. Future parking expansion, Willow Creek HOA. The words sat there, clean and confident, like whoever put them up never once considered they might be wrong. I could hear laughter in the distance, faint but sharp, drifting from the direction of the subdivision just beyond the tree line, where identical houses sat in perfect rows and lawns were trimmed like they were measured with rulers. That's when she showed up. Linda Crawford, white SUV, polished to a mirror shine, rolling up slow along the dirt path, like she owned every inch of ground her tires touched. She stepped out wearing sunglasses too. Expensive for farm dust and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that says decisions have already been made without you. Mr. Harper, she called out, voice smooth, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation in front of a mirror, we're improving the community. Improving. I looked past her at the machine still idling behind me, at the crushed rows, at the berries ground into the soil like they never mattered. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice level. You're on private property. She tilted her head slightly, like I'd just said something mildly amusing. Unused land, she corrected, tapping a folder against her palm, thick with papers I hadn't seen yet. The engine revved again behind me, another line of bushes disappearing under steel. And that's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was a plan they thought I couldn't stop. What she didn't know was that this land wasn't just mine. It was protected in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. I grew up counting rows, not square footage, and every one of those rows had a story if you knew where to look. The third row from the fence line still leaned slightly to the left because my father rushed the planting before a storm rolled in back in 1998. And the corner near the old irrigation valve always produced sweeter fruit because my mother insisted on adjusting the water flow by hand every summer evening like it was a ritual instead of a chore. I stood there watching strangers drive over all of it, and for a second the only sound I could hear was the faint memory of her voice telling me not to rush the harvest, telling me that good things take time even when the world tries to speed you up. This land is 40 acres total, 10 acres dedicated to blueberries, registered as a working farm long before Willow Creek was even a line on a developer's blueprint. My grandfather bought it in 1972 with money he saved fixing engines out of a single-bay garage, and he always said land was the only thing that did not lie to you if you treated it right. We paid taxes on it every year, filed crop reports, maintained irrigation lines that stretched over 2,000 feet, and every season we sent pallets of fruit to local distributors who knew our name without needing a label. There is a rhythm to farm life that does not care about suburban schedules or HOA meetings, a rhythm built on sunrise, soil moisture, and the weight of fruit in your hands. Linda Crawford did not understand any of that, and she did not need to because in her world numbers on paper mattered more than roots in the ground. She flipped open that folder and started talking about zoning adjustments, community expansion, and underutilized acreage like she was reading from a script designed to sound official but empty of anything real. I let her talk because sometimes the fastest way to understand someone is to let them explain exactly how far they think they can go. She mentioned property value increases, overflow parking for weekend events, and something about future development phases that would benefit everyone involved. Everyone except the person actually standing on the land, apparently. I bent down and picked up a handful of soil, letting it run through my fingers slowly, dark and rich, and still holding moisture from the last irrigation cycle. This was not empty land. This was active ground, maintained, recorded, documented. But I had learned something over the years, especially after taking over operations when my parents passed. People like Linda do not ignore facts because they do not know them. They ignore facts because they believe they can outmaneuver them. I straightened up and looked past her again, noticing something that made my stomach settle into a different kind of calm. The bulldozer had crossed a small marker post near the center line of the field, a metal tag half buried in the dirt that most people would never notice. I knew exactly what it was. It marked a section tied to a federal agricultural program we enrolled in 5 years ago, one that came with paperwork thicker than her entire folder combined. I did not react. I did not point it out. Instead, I nodded slightly like I was considering her offer, like I was just another landowner being pushed into a corner. Because the truth was, this was no longer about stopping them in that moment. This was about letting them show exactly how far they were willing to go before the wrong set of eyes started paying attention. I let her finish every word without interrupting, just standing there with dirt still clinging to my fingers while the machine behind me carved another slow line through the field, the sound steady and mechanical like it had all the time in the world. Linda adjusted her sunglasses and watched me the way people watch a negotiation they think they have already won, waiting for resistance so they can dismiss it. "We have the paperwork," she said, tapping that folder again, a sharp little rhythm meant to signal authority. "The board approved the expansion last quarter, and the county signed off on the preliminary plan." Preliminary. That word sat wrong in my ears. Too clean, too convenient. I nodded once, like I understood, like I was weighing options instead of measuring consequences. "You mind showing me that?" I asked, keeping my voice even, calm, the way my father used to when a deal started leaning sideways. She hesitated for half a second, just enough to notice, then handed over a stack of printed pages held together with a silver clip. The paper felt warm from sitting in her car, edges crisp, ink still fresh enough to smell faintly chemical. I flipped through slowly, not rushing, eyes scanning headings, signatures, stamps that looked official but not quite anchored to anything real. Zoning variance request. Community infrastructure improvement. Temporary land use adjustment. Words stacked on top of words, each one trying to sound bigger than the last. What I did not see was just as important as what I did. No agricultural exemption review. No federal compliance check. No reference to registered crop production. It was like they had built an entire plan around the assumption that nobody would bother checking beyond the first layer. Behind me, the bulldozer idled again, then pushed forward, and I heard the soft crackle of branches giving way under pressure, a sound that used to mean pruning season now twisted into something else entirely. I turned one page, then another, then stopped at a county seal. Stamped in blue ink. I had seen that seal before, more times than I could count, on tax documents, water usage permits, and annual reports filed with agencies that actually paid attention to what this land produced. This one looked right at first glance, but the alignment was off by a fraction. Just enough that if you knew what you were looking for, you could tell it had been rushed through or pushed without full review. I handed the stack back without a word. Linda smiled like she had just closed a sale. "We are prepared to offer compensation," she added, tone softening, like money could replace something rooted this deep. I glanced down the field again, following the line of crushed bushes until it met that small metal marker post I had noticed earlier, half buried but still there, still intact. 5 years ago, I stood in this exact spot with a federal inspector who measured soil composition down to the inch and explained what participation in a conservation and production program actually meant. There were maps, coordinates, documentation tied not just to the land but to how it was used, how it was maintained, how it contributed to a system bigger than any neighborhood plan. I remembered signing forms that took 3 hours to review, each page heavier than the last, because it carried weight beyond property lines. I remembered thinking at the time it felt excessive. Standing there now, Watching a machine roll over protected ground, I realized it was anything but. I looked back at Linda, still smiling, still confident, and gave a small nod like I was considering her offer seriously. "Give me a day," I said. She relaxed instantly, shoulders dropping just enough to show she believed she had momentum. "Of course," she replied, already turning back toward her SUV. The engine behind me roared a little louder as the operator pushed deeper into the field, unaware of what he had just crossed, unaware of the line that had already been passed. I stayed where I was until the sound settled back into that steady hum, then pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen lighting up in my hand, reflecting rows that were no longer straight. I did not call a lawyer. I did not call the county. I scrolled to a number I had not used in years, one tied to an office that did not move fast, did not care about neighborhood politics, and did not miss details once they were on record. My thumb hovered for a second, then pressed call as another line of bushes disappeared behind me. And this time I let it happen because I finally knew exactly how this was going to end. I did not move when the call connected, just held the phone to my ear while the machine behind me kept working like nothing had changed. The operator focused on his line, unaware that the ground beneath him was no longer just soil but evidence. A calm voice answered on the second ring, professional, steady, the kind of tone that does not rush because it does not need to. I gave my name, my farm registration number, and a brief description of what was happening, choosing each word carefully, the way you do when you know someone on the other end understands exactly what to listen for. There was a pause, not hesitation, just the sound of someone pulling up records, connecting dots faster than anyone at the county level ever could. "Can you confirm coordinates?" the voice asked. I walked 10 steps forward, stopping right at the metal marker post half buried in the dirt, brushing the top clean with my boot until the stamped numbers showed through. I read them out slowly, watching another set of tires roll past just a few yards away, crushing what used to be a clean irrigation path. Another pause, longer this time, followed by a quiet exhale that told me everything I needed to know. "Sir," the voice said, tone shifting just enough to carry weight. "That section is part of an active federal agricultural program with soil preservation restrictions. Any unauthorized alteration is a violation." I looked up across the field, toward the sign planted in the center like a claim nobody had earned, and felt something settle into place inside me. "They have already started," I replied. The response came back measured, precise. "Document everything. Do not interfere. We will escalate this. Do not interfere." I almost smiled at that, because for the first time since I saw that bulldozer, doing nothing felt like the strongest move I had. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, turning just as Linda's SUV door shut with a clean click behind me. She walked over again, slower this time, confident in the way people are when they think time is on their side. "We can have the area cleared by the end of the week," she said, gesturing toward the field like it was already hers. "Grading will start after that." I nodded once, eyes moving past her to the crew marking new lines with spray paint, bright streaks cutting across rows that used to be measured with care instead of convenience. "You have a schedule," I said quietly. "Of course," she replied, smiling again. "We are very organized." Organized. The word echoed differently now. I bent down and picked up one of the small blue flags they had stuck into the ground, turning it between my fingers, the plastic thin, temporary, designed to be pulled up once the real work was done. They thought this was temporary. They thought the land would just adjust. I pushed the flag back into the dirt exactly where it had been, pressing it down firm. "Just make sure you follow through," I said, meeting her eyes for a second longer than before. She held the look, confident, unshaken, then gave a small nod like she had just secured agreement. "We always do," she answered. I stepped back, giving the machine more room, letting it pass within a few feet of me as it moved forward again, the engine louder now, the smell thicker, the ground trembling under each rotation of the tracks. I watched it cross another marker, this one smaller, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, tied to a different part of the program, another layer they had not accounted for. Every pass they made, every foot they covered, they were not just building something new, they were stacking violations, deeper, clearer, harder to ignore. The sun climbed higher, heat pressing down across the field, and for a moment everything looked almost normal from a distance, like just another construction project in progress. But up close, standing where the soil had been turned and the rows broken, I could see the lines they had crossed, the ones written in documents they had never read. I took one last look at the field, at the crushed berries staining the dirt dark, at the machines carving paths they thought would lead to profit, and then I turned and walked back to my truck without another word, because the next move was already in motion, and this time it was not mine to make. I did not go back to the house right away. Instead, I parked under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the same one where my grandfather used to sit every evening with a thermos of coffee, watching the sun drop behind the far fence line like it was something you earned just by putting in a full day's work. From there, I could still hear the machines, faint but steady, a low mechanical rhythm cutting through what used to be quiet. I pulled out my phone again, not to call anyone this time, but to document everything. Photos first. Wide shots of the field showing the equipment, the fresh tracks, the sign planted dead center like a flag. Then close shots. The crushed rows, the exposed roots, the marker posts partially buried but still visible if you knew where to look. I made sure to capture the coordinates stamped into the metal, zooming in until the numbers were clear enough to read without question. Then I switched to video, slow pans across the damage, the sound of engines filling the background, voices of workers calling out measurements and distances like they were laying out something permanent. Because in their minds, they were. I kept recording until my storage warning popped up, then stopped and just sat there for a moment, listening. The air still carried that mix of sweetness and fuel, a combination that did not belong on farmland but was now soaked into it. About 20 minutes later, a pickup truck rolled up the dirt path toward the field, county logo on the door, tires kicking up dust in a lazy arc behind it. I recognized the driver before he even stepped out. Mark Ellis, county inspector. I had seen him at zoning meetings, permit reviews, the kind of guy who knew the rules but also knew which ones people liked to bend. He walked over to Linda first, clipboard in hand. Posture relaxed like this was just another routine check. I stayed where I was, watching from a distance, close enough to see gestures, not close enough to hear every word. Linda handed him a copy of her paperwork, pointing toward the field, explaining something with confident movements, the same rhythm she used with me earlier. Mark nodded, flipping through pages, occasionally glancing up at the work being done. Then he looked down at the ground, scanning the area like he was actually paying attention now. He walked a few steps forward, stopping near one of the marker posts that had not been completely crushed, crouching slightly to get a better look. Even from where I stood, I could see the shift. It was subtle, just a pause that lasted a second longer than normal, but it was there. He stood up, said something to Linda, and pointed toward the far side of the field, closer to where the second set of markers ran in a line most people would never notice. Linda's posture tightened, just a fraction, her head tilting as if she did not like the direction the conversation was going. Mark made a call, stepping away from her, turning his back slightly like he needed space to say something he did not want overheard. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I had made a similar call less than an hour ago. The difference was, his call was happening because the situation had already crossed a line, not because he expected it might. He hung up and walked back toward Linda, this time not looking at her paperwork first, but at the field, at the machines, at the sections already cleared. The operator of the bulldozer slowed, then stopped completely, engine idling as if waiting for direction. For the first time since I arrived, the noise dropped just enough that the silence felt noticeable. Linda crossed her arms, saying something sharper now, her movements quicker, less controlled. Mark shook his head once, firm, then pointed again toward the markers. I saw Linda glance down, following his gesture, and for a split second, the confidence slipped. Just a crack. Just enough to see that she was realizing there was something she had not accounted for. I leaned back against the truck, arms resting on the hood, and watched it unfold without moving an inch, because this was exactly what I had been waiting for. Not an argument, not a threat, just the moment when the right person notices the wrong detail at the right time. I could see the exact moment it shifted, not in some dramatic gesture, but in the way Mark Ellis stopped flipping through Linda's paperwork and started looking at the ground instead, really looking this time, like the soil itself was telling him something the documents were not. He walked farther into the field, boots pressing into dirt that had been turned too recently, stopping at the second marker line I knew would catch his attention if he got close enough. He crouched again, brushing dirt aside with his hand, exposing the metal tag fully, and even from 30 yards away I could tell he was reading it twice. When he stood up this time, there was no casual posture left in him. He pulled out his phone immediately, dialing without hesitation, his back turned again, but his stance different now, more rigid, more deliberate. Linda followed him a few steps, trying to keep the conversation contained, her voice sharper, faster, like she was trying to regain control of something that was already slipping. The bulldozer stayed idle, engine humming low, the operator looking between them like he was waiting for instructions that were not coming. I stayed right where I was, leaning against the truck, arms crossed loosely, letting the heat settle into my shoulders, letting time do exactly what it needed to do. Mark ended the call and walked straight back to Linda. No clipboard this time, no paperwork in his hands, just a look that said the conversation had changed. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. Federal designation, he said, pointing down toward the marker. Linda shook her head immediately, dismissive at first, like it was just another technicality she could talk her way around. He pointed again, more firmly this time, then gestured toward the cleared sections, the tracks, the areas already disturbed. She followed his hand, and I watched her expression tighten, not confusion, not yet, but something closer to calculation. Mark spoke again, slower, each word spaced like he wanted them to land clearly. You cannot proceed. That part carried across the field without effort. The operator shut the machine down completely this time, the engine winding to silence, leaving nothing but the sound of wind moving lightly through what was left of the rows. Linda crossed her arms, saying something I could not hear, but her posture told the story. She was not backing down. Not yet. Mark reached into his truck, pulled out a bright orange notice, and walked back toward the center of the field. He planted it firmly into the ground near the sign they had put up earlier, the two markers standing side by side, like competing claims to the same space. Even from a distance, I could read enough. Stop work order. The word sat there, bold, impossible to ignore. Linda stepped closer to him, gesturing toward her documents again, trying to reframe the situation, trying to bring it back to something she understood. Mark did not even take the papers this time. He just shook his head once and pointed again toward the marker line, then toward the cleared sections, connecting the two like a simple equation. Cause and consequence. She turned, finally looking out across the field the way I had been looking at it all morning, and for the first time, she was not seeing opportunity. She was seeing exposure. I pushed myself off the truck and walked a few steps forward, not enough to join them, just enough to be seen clearly. Linda's eyes flicked toward me for a second, and this time there was no smile waiting behind them. Just a brief, tight look that said she was starting to understand she had stepped into something bigger than a neighborhood decision. I said nothing. I did not need to. The field said enough on its own, and the markers she had ignored were now doing exactly what they were designed to do, turning a quiet piece of land into something that could not be rewritten with a stack of local paperwork. The silence that settled over the area was different now, heavier, like everything had paused not because it was finished, but because something else was about to take over. The silence did not last long, but it lasted just enough to feel different from everything that came before it, like the land itself had taken a breath and was waiting to see who would speak next. Linda was the first to move, stepping closer to the orange notice as if proximity alone could make it less real, her heels pressing into dirt that no longer gave the same way it used to. She bent slightly, reading the words again, slower this time, her lips tightening as she reached the bottom line where the authority was printed in bold, unmistakable letters. Federal. That word carries a different weight when you are used to running things at the neighborhood level, when your power comes from meetings and votes and signatures that stay inside county lines. She straightened up and turned back to Mark, her voice lower now, controlled, trying to find footing in a situation that was already moving past her. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, just repeated what had already been said in a tone that left no room for interpretation. Work stops here. No exceptions. No extensions. Just a line drawn in the same dirt they had been tearing through all morning. The crew stood off to the side now, tools in hand, waiting, unsure whether to pack up or hold position, caught in that space between instruction and consequence. One of them kicked lightly at the ground near a crushed bush, the dark stain of berries still visible against the soil, a quiet reminder of what had already been done. I walked a few steps closer, stopping near the edge of the cleared section, the difference between untouched rows and flattened ground sharp enough to feel without touching it. Linda looked at me again, longer this time, like she was trying to recalculate everything she had assumed about this situation. There was no anger in her expression, not yet, just the realization that the script she came in with did not apply anymore. "You knew," she said, not loud, but clear enough to carry. I met her gaze without shifting. "I know my land," I answered, keeping it simple, because anything more would have been unnecessary. Mark stepped back toward his truck, already making another call, this one shorter, more direct, the kind that sets the next part of a process in motion. I heard enough to catch the words escalation and documentation, followed by a confirmation that made his posture relax just slightly, like a piece of the puzzle had just locked into place. Linda turned away from me then, pacing a few steps, scanning the field again, but now she was not looking at it like a project. She was looking at it like a problem she could not solve with a meeting or a motion. The sign they had planted earlier stood a few feet from the stop work notice, both of them catching the same sunlight, but only one of them mattered now. A breeze moved across the field, light but steady, brushing through the remaining rows, carrying a faint scent of fruit that had not been crushed yet, a reminder that not everything had been lost. I took a slow breath, letting that scent settle in, grounding myself in something real while everything else shifted around it. The sound of another vehicle approached from the road, different from the earlier trucks, heavier, official in a way you could feel before you saw it. Mark glanced up, then back at Linda, and I saw it in his expression before he even spoke. This was no longer just a county issue. This was moving beyond that, into a space where local decisions did not hold the final word. Linda followed his gaze toward the approaching vehicle, and for the first time since she stepped onto my land, she did not look in control. She looked like someone who had just realized that the ground beneath her was never hers to manage in the first place. The vehicle that pulled up was not marked like the others, no bright logos, no oversized decals trying to prove authority, just a clean white government SUV with a small seal on the door that most people would not notice unless they knew what to look for. It rolled to a stop at the edge of the field, tires settling into the dirt with a soft crunch that sounded almost respectful compared to everything that had come before it. Two people stepped out, both in plain work attire, boots already dusted from places like this, carrying folders that looked thicker than anything Linda had brought. They did not rush. They did not announce themselves. They simply walked straight toward the marker line like it was the only thing that mattered, because to them, it was. Mark gave a short nod as they approached, stepping aside without needing to say anything, the kind of silent handoff that happens when jurisdiction shifts without argument. Linda took a step forward, ready to speak, but the taller of the two inspectors raised a hand slightly, not dismissive, just precise, like he had done this before and knew exactly how it needed to go. He crouched at the marker, brushed away the dirt carefully, and read the numbers out loud, confirming them against the documents in his folder. The second inspector moved farther down the line, checking the next marker, then the next, building a pattern that connected every section the machines had already touched. I watched them work, methodical, quiet, each movement adding weight to something that was already forming. The taller one stood and looked across the cleared area, then back at Linda, his expression neutral but firm. "Who authorized ground disturbance in a protected agricultural zone?" he asked, voice calm, controlled, but carrying across the field without effort. Linda started speaking immediately, referencing permits, approvals, community needs, the same structure she had used all morning, but the words did not land the same way here. The inspector listened without interruption, then flipped open his folder and pointed to a page, tapping a section that was probably filled with language she had never read. "This land is enrolled in a federal conservation and production program," he said, each word measured. "Any alteration requires federal clearance prior to any activity." He gestured toward the machines, the tracks, the sections already cleared. This did not happen. The second inspector joined him, adding notes, taking photos, documenting angles, distances, damage to soil structure, everything that turned a moment into a record. Linda's posture shifted again, shoulders pulling tighter, arms no longer crossed in confidence but held closer, protective, like she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. "We can correct this," she said, voice lower now, less certain, searching for a way back. The inspector shook his head once, not harsh, just final. "This is no longer a correction issue," he replied, closing the folder with a soft, definitive sound. "This is a compliance and enforcement matter." The crew began stepping back without being told, tools lowered, conversations fading into silence as the reality of the situation settled in around them. I took a few steps forward, stopping near the edge of the cleared section again, looking out over what was left and what had been changed, the line between them sharper than ever. The inspector glanced at me briefly, just long enough to confirm identity, then gave a small nod, acknowledging what I already knew. This had moved beyond anything the HOA could control. Linda followed his gaze to me again, and this time there was no question in her eyes, no calculation, just the clear understanding that the ground she tried to claim had rules she could not override. The breeze picked up slightly, moving across the field, lifting dust from the disturbed areas and carrying it toward the untouched rows, but it did not reach them fully. The boundary held, and standing there, watching federal authority draw lines that could not be erased with paperwork or meetings, I realized something simple and absolute. They had not just stepped onto my land. They had stepped into a system that was designed to protect it long before they ever showed up. The field stayed quiet long after the inspectors finished their notes, like the land itself was absorbing everything that had just happened, settling back into something steadier after being pushed too far. The machines were shut down completely now, parked at awkward angles where they had been left mid-task, their tracks cutting clean, undeniable lines through soil that had taken years to build and only minutes to disturb. The inspectors moved methodically, placing additional markers, photographing every section, documenting the damage with a level of precision that made it clear this was no longer about stopping a project. It was about accounting for every inch that had been altered. Linda stood a few yards away, arms no longer crossed, folder held loosely at her side. The confidence she walked in with replaced by a kind of stillness that did not come from control, but from understanding. She tried once more, stepping forward, voice quieter now, asking about options, about timelines, about what could be done to move forward. The taller inspector listened, then answered in the same steady tone he had used all afternoon, explaining that any further action would be determined at a level beyond local influence, that restoration requirements would be issued, that compliance was not optional. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just clear, measured consequences that carried more weight than anything she had said all day. I walked slowly along the edge of the field, boots pressing into ground that felt uneven now, stopping where the first row had been crushed earlier that morning. The bushes were flattened, branches bent and dark with fruit that would never be picked, but just beyond them, the next row still stood, leaves catching the light, berries intact, waiting. The line between damage and survival was sharp, almost surgical, and it held. I crouched down, brushing a bit of loose soil back into place around the base of one of the remaining plants, the motion automatic, something I had done thousands of times without thinking. The air smelled different already, less of diesel, more of earth, like the land was trying to reset itself piece by piece. Behind me, the inspectors wrapped up, one of them handing Mark a set of papers, another confirming something over the phone before closing his folder with that same final, quiet certainty. Linda did not look at them anymore. She looked at the field, really looked this time, taking in the markers, the notices, the sections that would have to be accounted for, and the parts that could not be touched again. When her eyes met mine, there was no argument left in them, no attempt to reclaim ground that was never hers. Just a brief, silent acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond anything she could control. I stood up, wiping my hands against my jeans, and looked out across the rows, following the lines the way my father taught me, checking what remained, measuring what would. Need time to recover. The sun had shifted lower now, casting longer shadows across the field, stretching the markers into thin lines that pointed back toward the house, toward the life that had been built here long before any subdivision existed. One of the inspectors paused near me on his way back to the vehicle, giving a small nod, not congratulatory, just respectful, like one professional recognizing another who understood the system well enough to let it work. I returned the nod, Nothing more needed. The white SUV pulled away slowly, tires leaving lighter tracks than the machines had, tracks that would fade quickly with the next ring. Mark followed soon after, his truck disappearing down the same path, leaving the field to its own quiet again. I stayed where I was a little longer, listening to the wind move through the remaining rows, the soft rustle of leaves replacing the noise that had filled the space earlier. It was not perfect. It would take time, but it was still mine. And as I looked out over the land, at the markers that now protected it instead of being ignored, one thought settled in, clear and steady. They thought it was just empty ground. They never realized it came with rules stronger than anything they could write, and patience that outlasted everything they tried to change.